With Labour promising more regulations on residential buy-to-let landlords, is commercial buy-to-let the answer to escape the red tape? That is the topic on today's show here on Property Answers. I'm joined by John and Ranjan, who will be discussing this for you. Welcome. Good one today.
Hi there.
You going to enjoy this one?
I'm definitely going to enjoy
Talk about
this
the red
one.
tape?
Can I tell you why?
Yep.
Briefly, because a few years ago, Ranjan suggested I do very little commercial property,
Okay.
which one is not true, and secondly, I've written a book about it. So just to spite Ranjan, to prove it. So there you go.
And pop your book in as well. And don't forget to comment on this video as well, and like and subscribe to the channel as well. So let's start with you then, John.
Yes.
Answer the question
Well,
away.
to be honest with you, I love commercial. One of the reasons I love commercial is at the moment, commercial is at the lowest level it's been pro rata for many, many, many years. I mean, recently I purchased commercial 35,000 square feet of commercial space, £36 a foot.
Wow.
Now, bearing in mind it will cost £236 to build it, never mind the land, you can see why I'm so excited about commercial. There are great, great opportunities in the commercial field. You need to know what you're doing. And remember, you've got empty rates while it's empty, unless it's listed. If it's listed, there's no empty rates. With what's happening with the residential market in terms of the, the government and what's happening there and all the restrictions, for some people, it might be worth pivoting. Not everybody, but some people might quite like pivoting. You've got a lot less management problems. You can buy all over the UK. It doesn't matter where it is. You're not going to drive past it every day. And I think for some people, it could be a great alternative.
Yeah.
No, absolutely agree. I mean, it does need a lot more learning, because I think with residential property,
funny that
we all live in them.
Yeah.
A lot of us have rented residential properties in the past, so we know something about it. So that's why a lot of people get into it. Whereas commercial, very few people have actually rented or been a commercial tenant before and actually understand what's going on. So that's why it needs a little bit of learning. But the benefit, I think, is that when we talk about residential property, and people will know who watch this channel, the rules have been changing. It seems every other week Govey has had a new idea or whatever, and you don't know whether it's law or not. Is it coming in tomorrow? What's coming in next month? All this sort of stuff. But our commercial lets are rented out on an Act of Parliament dating 1954, which actually is long, long before I was even born. Yeah. So there's a lot of stability in regulation. And why? Because businesses tend to rent commercial properties and businesses don't tend to have a direct vote. So there doesn't seem to be this electioneering football with commercial property tenancies.
Yeah.
So can I just explain the 1954 Act to Ranjan?
Go on.
So if you buy a property which is let out and it's within the 1954 Act, it means when that lease expires, you have to offer the tenant exactly the same or very similar lease again. So you can't just boot them out. Okay. If it's outside the Act, technically you can. If you're in Scotland, there is no 1954 Act at all. So it's a different law in Scotland. So Scotland is like not being within inside the Act in the UK in the rest of the UK. So Wales and England, 1954 Act's very important to know about. Scotland, you don't need to worry about.
I think what happens these days is that when you are renting out a commercial unit, if you're renting it out to a high street multiple or a big brand, they will insist on having the tenancy within the Act.
Within the Act, yeah.
But if you are a landlord renting to a smaller operator, perhaps a barber's shop or an independent trader, then you will say that this property is only being offered outside the Act.
Of the Act, yeah.
And that means that, what that means is at the end of the tenancy, the landlord has the choice whether to renew it or not, and what rent to charge at the end of that tenancy. If it's inside the Act, as all the big chains will insist on, at the end of the tenancy, they have the right to renew on the same terms as the existing lease, but at the current market rent.
I think the one thing to remember with commercial property, and we're talking more about the commercial side than we are the residential side, because to be fair, most people, as Ranjan rightly said, know about buy-to-lets to a point. The great thing about the commercial, you could buy a part a part let commercial, so you've got some rent coming in to cover some of the mortgage, with a vacant space that once you let that vacant space, you could double your money, genuinely double your money, if you get it right.
Yep.
And there's no way you can do that in the residential space anymore. I would say the commercial market at the moment is similar to what it was like when Ranjan started his property journey 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
That's how it is, genuinely. There's that few people out there doing it.
Yeah.
Now, one of the reasons for that is funding. It's very hard to borrow more than 50% loan to value, which is exactly what it was when you first started in the 1950s, 1960s, Ranjan. So you could only ever borrow a 50% loan to value.
Okay.
And that's what it's like in the commercial field. Less banks, more opportunities, because if you've got some capital, you've got less competition. And there are, some banks that will lend on a longer term once it's let, but they normally only lend for the shortest length of lease. So if you've got a 5-year lease, they'll lend you the money on an overdraft probably for 5 years. So that's what you've got to remember with the funding.
Commercial, obviously buy-to-let residential funding is very similar to domestic mortgages, homeowner mortgages, whereas commercial loans or commercial buy-to-let funding is very similar to commercial loans, business-to-business loans, which is a slightly different ball game and something that people need to educate themselves on. But I do think commercial property offers that unique way of adding value, because you cannot buy a 2-bedroom flat and put a tenant in it and it's worth more. You have to do something to it. Because the residential properties are valued on bricks and mortar basis, on comparables and that kind of stuff. But a commercial property is worth a lot less with no tenant, and is worth a lot more with a good tenant, and worth slightly less with not so good a tenant. So much depends on the occupier, how stable they are, how much rent they're paying, what security they offer, and all of that sort of stuff, which adds to the value. And that's unique because you've got 2 identical properties. One's let to one tenant, one's let to another tenant, and they're worth different amounts simply because of the occupier.
And that's all valued on what we call yield, so return on the money. So for most people watching this, if you've got a local family business in one of your shops or going into one of your shops, for 5 years, I would say roughly, probably it's worth around 10% yield. And it's a 10% yield whether it's in Manchester, Preston, Burnley, or potentially perhaps London, it might be slightly less.
Well.
But certainly anywhere outside London, it would be the same. So it's based on the rental income and the yield. If you had, rather than the local family business, you had Amazon taking a warehouse, that would be probably now on a 5% yield because of the value of the tenant and the fact they're not going to go bust or anything else. So it's all risk and reward to a great extent as well.
And are the banks willing to lend on commercial units? If you're brand new into this market and you think, actually, I want to go into the commercial side rather than residential, are banks happy with anyone just applying?
I think they will lend. I mean, we're both a little bit spoilt on that side, to be fair. But I think they will lend, but maximum 50%. And they want to see how you're going to let it. They want to see some
business plans,
business plan advice. What I would say, they're much more likely if you get mixed use, which is perhaps residential upstairs with a vacant shop, because they know there's some guaranteed income coming from the flats. Then that's probably a softer way to start than a pure vacant large commercial building, I would say.
And that's probably the only way you can start, actually, because I think the other unique thing with commercial funding is that whether I go for my first buy-to-let mortgage, residential buy-to-let mortgage, or my 10th buy-to-let residential mortgage, by and large, I'm getting exactly the same terms.
They treat you the same.
There's no difference. It's the product rate that's on the website.
Yep.
But when you get your first buy-to-let commercial, you'll have the most expensive terms you'll ever have. And then it gets better after that. Yep. And it is all by negotiation because it's not just about the property, it's about you and your business, and it's also about the tenants you're putting in. So it gets easier. So as John rightly says, it's a great idea to start off with those mixed use types of properties because you're taking a building, say you've got a 3-story building, 2/3 of the floor plate is residential, 1/3 is commercial. So 2/3 of the floor plate is something you know something about.
Yeah.
Can I
Wow,
also just say, if you buy a commercial building that's already let,
Okay.
that's not a bad thing, as long as you think on the rent review, it's going to go up in value. Now, in the old days, a lot of people would buy a shop that was let with a rent review in, say, 2 years' time, and they'd work it out that in 2 years' time, that rent would perhaps go from 10,000 to 15,000, making it worth that much more on a yield. I've recently got some property in the Midlands, and we've recently had a rent review, and it went up £40,000.
Okay.
Now that made £600,000 difference to what it was worth beforehand to what it's worth now, and that's what commercial is all about. That's what it's all about.
So is that your answer to the question?
Yes.
Commercial all the way.
Commercial is quite fascinating, and I think it also, with residential property, you often read in the newspaper that Area X has gone up massively this year. It's boomed, it's up and coming, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And when you read that in the newspaper, what do you do about it? Well, you can't exactly go for residential because most of that, they're reporting what's happened.
Yep.
But here's the thing. Because commercial tenancies tend to be 5 years or 10 years, and the rent reviews tend to be, some are 3 years, but most are 5 years.
Most are 5 these days, aren't they?
What happens is when an area starts to regenerate from a residential point of view, a lot of the shops in that area lag behind a little bit. So if you go into it, and I've experienced literally more than doubling in rents, where you've got into an area where the residential side is up and come in the last 18 months, and then you're picking off commercial assets quite cheap. And the next rent review, because the residential area is uplifted, you suddenly get a massive boost in your rent review.
Yeah.
And there are lots of little tricks like that in commercial, which are rather unique.
There are. I was a director of Cambridge United for 18 years football club. I then bought the ground and leased it back to the club.
Okay.
And I leased it back on a rental increase linked to retail price index. So after 5 years, it went up with whatever the retail price index had gone up. So there's no need to renegotiate, no negotiation or anything else. That's what it is. And that's another good way. So if you get a lease, if you're buying an investment and the lease is linked to RPI or something similar to that, that's quite good.
No penalty clauses
no
in that
penalty clauses.
Penalty.
No penalty
like
clauses. That's very good. That was a football one.
Very
That's
good.
as much about football as he knows. He knows nothing about football. But you're absolutely right. Well done.
That's a very good one.
But actually, that's quite a good way of so just check. How the increases are negotiated, because that's important.
So we've talked quite a bit about residential buy-to-let. With the Labour government, do you think they're going to make any significant changes to commercial?
Good question. I think there's far less chance of them changing anything to do with commercial compared to residential. I think they will change the residential. We've already spoken about that on past episodes. But commercially, I don't think there's much they're going to change.
Okay.
May change the rate system. The rate system at the moment is very archaic. I think it should be linked to VAT, turnover, be much simpler. They might try and do that, but on the whole, no.
No. Ranjan?
I kind of agree with that. I don't think there are any votes in it to change the leases and stuff like that.
No.
But business rates reform is definitely on the table.
It needs to be as well.
It does need to
It's
be.
been kicked down the Tories have kicked it down the can down the road for many years.
I think the problem with turnover linked and all of that, it's so easily massaged.
It's such a good idea. Such a good idea.
I think it's
Ranjan.
unimplementable.
I don't, because you link it to the VAT. You collect it when you collect the VAT.
Yep.
Well,
and also warehouses then who pay far less rates. It's wrong. It's unfair.
Then
the same with online businesses.
Then that's the problem. Then you'll I'll set up a company which is just trading in my shop, because otherwise, how do I differentiate my online sales from which have nothing to do which are not coming out of my shop? But they're just in the same limited company. So you'll just force me to have two limited companies, one for my online side, one for my
Well, not everyone's
shop
as
side.
devious devious issue, they
And,
might actually
well,
just pay it.
You say devious. I'm talking about structures that Starbucks, Nike, all the companies do. So it's only I'm just adopting best worldwide business practice. So you'd set up 2 companies, and then you'd end up your shop would buy stuff from your online business and make no profit.
So you don't think my idea is very good enough?
I don't think that's very good, and it also doesn't really help with low. The problem is, as the old saying goes, turnover is what's
vanity.
Vanity. Profit is sanity.
Yep.
So there are lots of low turnover businesses. I mean, petrol retailing is a classic. So you cannot really charge on turnover. It has to be profit, and I think that would be such a pig's ear
You
to
can make
regulate.
exceptions to the rule.
Well, I think they'll just push every shop out of business. I think the thing to fear from a landlord's perspective is some notion that the landlord needs to cover the business rate.
Business rate, yeah.
Instead of the tenant. Now, of course, it will be added to the rent, but it's still an extra administrative burden on the commercial landlord.
Yeah, and what we didn't say actually is that when you've got a full repairing and insuring lease, which FRI lease is what you want, of course, you have no outgoings whatsoever. The rent is the rent. Whereas, of course, with a property, you're constantly having to repair it and insure it and everything
Other
else.
outgoings. Yeah.
And we've talked about in previous videos about the rent reform and the leasehold reform and service charges and all of that. If you have a what I call a CMO, a commercial building and multiple occupation, where you have multiple commercial tenants in one building, they normally pay a service charge per square foot. And those service charge regulations are not affected by anything that's been proposed
Absolutely.
in the leasehold reform. And also, the landlord is free to charge a management fee for running that building as well. So there are lots of things that are quite favourable with the current commercial regulations. So I don't think they're going to be touched.
And that was a very quick answer, Ranjan.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
And on that note, thank you for staying with us here on Property Answers. Great discussion, that one today. Thanks for tuning in, and do remember to like and subscribe this video and click that bell, and you'll get notified for all of our new videos coming your way right here on Property Answers.